The first tremor, the faintest precursor to the earthquake that would eventually swallow Karen Pendleton whole, arrived via a crisply folded note tucked under my windshield wiper. Excessive vehicular presence, it declared, regarding my own truck parked, as it had been for a decade, in my own driveway. This was 3 days before the annual Police Benevolent Fundraiser, an event I'd hosted in my backyard for the past 5 years. An event that, this year, held a sharper, more poignant edge, dedicated to the memory of Officer Miller, my partner, whose kids were the direct beneficiaries of a significant portion of the proceeds. Karen, president of our homeowners association, self-appointed guardian of suburban serenity and chief architect of its many petty tyrannies, had apparently decided my quiet cul-de-sac existence was now an affront to her delicate sensibilities. I'd lived here long enough to recognize the signs. The slight twitch of her curtains when I brought home the catering supplies. The almost imperceptible narrowing of her eyes as the marquee tent rental truck navigated our street. She was a predator, sensing a deviation from the established grazing patterns, a tiny, shrill raptor circling. I crumpled the note. It was printed on HOA letterhead, a parody of officialdom, signed with a flourish that suggested she believed herself empowered by some divine right of busybodies. The authority she wielded was a flimsy construct of bylaws so convoluted and selectively enforced they amounted to little more than a codification of her whims. I, Mark Sterling, retired homicide detective, had navigated the labyrinthine politics of the precinct, faced down men whose eyes held genuine malice, not the watery indignation of a middle-aged woman with too much time and too little significance. Her opening salvo was noted, filed away in that part of my brain reserved for minor irritants, like a stone in a shoe. The next day, another note. Potential noise ordinance violation. Preemptive warning. This one was for the sound system check. 2 speakers, positioned to ensure the police chief's address wouldn't be lost to the rustle of leaves, tested at a volume barely above conversation level for precisely 5 minutes. Karen must have had a decibel meter permanently affixed to her ear. My wife, Sarah, found it amusing. She's building her case, Mark. What's next? A citation for breathing too loudly in your own yard? Her humor was a balm, but beneath it, I sensed the familiar weariness that Karen instilled in all of us. We were the silent majority, too busy with actual lives to engage in the trench warfare of HOA politics. My son, Leo, home from college for the summer, suggested a counteroffensive involving a strategically placed garden gnome he'd named Generalissimo Francisco Nomeo. But I counseled patience. This was Karen's overture. The opera of her self-destruction was yet to begin. The dormant authority within me, the part that had spent 30 years observing, analyzing, and acting with surgical precision, began to stir. Not with anger, not yet. That would come. For now, it was a cold, detached curiosity. The same I'd feel examining a particularly peculiar piece of evidence at a crime scene. Karen was, in her own small way, a perpetrator of disruption, a thief of peace. And I had a very particular set of skills for dealing with those. The preparations continued. The string lights, the tables, the discreet security camera I installed every year, ostensibly to monitor the donation box, but also, pragmatically, to record the event for posterity. This year, its lens seemed to linger a little longer on the Pendleton residence across the street, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from a meticulously, almost aggressively, landscaped face. The day of the fundraiser dawned bright, an almost offensively perfect sky arching over our little patch of suburban defiance. Volunteers from the precinct auxiliary bustled, caterers laid out chafing dishes, and the first of the uniformed officers began to arrive. Their cruisers parked neatly along one side of the street, a silent, gleaming testament to the event's purpose. Chief Reynolds, a man I'd shared more stakeouts and bad coffee with than I cared to count, clapped me on the shoulder. Good turnout shaping up, Mark. Miller would have, well, he'd be making some inappropriate jokes right now. God rest his soul. His smile was tinged with sadness, a shared grief that underscored the importance of the day. The atmosphere was convivial, a blend of solemn remembrance and genuine community spirit. Children, many of them the sons and daughters of officers present, chased each other on the lawn, their laughter a counterpoint to the quiet conversations of their parents. Then Karen Pendleton made her entrance. Not onto my property, of course. That would require a level of social grace she hadn't possessed since the Carter administration. No, she materialized on her own porch. A sentinel in a beige pantsuit, arms crossed, radiating disapproval like a faulty microwave. Her first direct assault was on young Officer Davies, who had, in a moment of understandable human need, parked his personal vehicle slightly encroaching on the pristine, HOA mandated 5-foot grass verge in front of her house. She didn't speak. She gesticulated, a flurry of sharp, stabbing motions towards the offending tire, her face a mask of apoplectic rage. Davies, bless his rookie heart, looked bewildered, then apologetic, and moved his car immediately, muttering something about Dragon Lady as he rejoined the party. I watched this from my deck, a glass of iced tea in hand. The surgical precision I prided myself on was, at that moment, focused entirely on resisting the urge to launch a water balloon. Sarah touched my arm. Don't! She wants a reaction. She was right. Karen fed on confrontation. My disengagement was, in itself, a small act of defiance. The party continued, the volume rising with the influx of guests, off-duty cops, their families, local business owners who sponsored the event, even a couple of city council members. The chief was due to speak in 30 minutes. The band, a rather good blues ensemble fronted by a sergeant from the traffic division, was tuning up. It was then that Karen escalated. She strode to the edge of her property line, a ruler in hand. I kid you not, a yellow, wooden ruler, and began measuring the distance from my fence to the nearest fold-out table, which happened to be laden with cookies baked by the sheriff's wife. Her pronouncements, delivered at a volume clearly intended to carry across the yard, were about Bylaw 17, subsection C, paragraph 4, setbacks for temporary structures. A few officers looked over, amusement dawning on their faces. This was better than any floor show. One detective, a known wisecracker named Henderson, called out, "Hey, Karen, you missed a spot. Pretty sure that cooler's at least 3 inches too close to the azaleas." Karen's head snapped around, her face mottling. She was losing control, her meticulously constructed reality of absolute dominion being chipped away by laughter and the sheer, unadulterated presence of authority that wasn't hers. The air crackled. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was a public challenge, a territorial dispute played out before an audience of the very people sworn to uphold actual laws, not her ludicrous, self-serving interpretations of neighborhood covenants. The dormant warrior within me didn't just stir. It sat up, stretched, and began to methodically check its equipment. The chief was mid-sentence, his voice resonating with heartfelt sincerity as he spoke of Miller's dedication, of the thin blue line, of the community's vital support, when the first wail of a siren cut through the afternoon air. Not the convivial chirp of an arriving guest, but the urgent, piercing cry of a unit on a call. Heads turned. A ripple of unease went through the crowd, especially among the uniformed officers. Years of conditioning. A siren meant trouble. Another joined it, closer this time. From my vantage point on the deck, I saw Karen Pendleton standing ramrod straight on her porch, a smug, triumphant smirk plastered across her face. In her hand, a cell phone held aloft like a scepter. She'd done it. The absolute, unmitigated gall. She'd called the cops on a police fundraiser, attended by half the damn department and the chief himself. My blood didn't boil. It froze. The transition from detached observer to operator was instantaneous. All the years of training, of facing down arrogance and stupidity in countless interrogation rooms, coalesced into a single, diamond-hard point of focus. She had crossed a line. Not a property line measured with a ridiculous ruler, but a moral event horizon. This wasn't about noise, or parking, or the placement of a cookie table. This was a desecration, a calculated act of malice, directed at an event honoring sacrifice and supporting the vulnerable. My internal monologue, usually a dry, sarcastic commentary, went silent, replaced by a cold, precise litany of her transgressions, each one a nail in the coffin she was so diligently building for herself. The chief paused, a flicker of annoyance, then professional concern, crossing his face. "Excuse me a moment," he said into the microphone, his voice calm, but with an underlying edge of steel I knew well. 2 patrol cars, lights flashing, pulled up to the curb, their arrival scattering a few startled guests near the entrance to my driveway. 2 young officers, looking grim and ready for action, emerged. One had his hand near his service weapon. They strode purposefully towards my yard, their eyes scanning for the source of the major disturbance they'd clearly been dispatched to handle. I saw Karen take a step forward on her porch, practically vibrating with anticipation. This was her moment of vindication, the validation of her perceived authority. The officers reached the edge of my driveway, their expressions shifting from resolute to utterly baffled as they took in the scene. Dozens of their colleagues, many in uniform, the police chief standing on a small stage, banners proclaiming, "Police Benevolent Fundraiser, the scent of barbecue, the sound of children laughing," now hushed. Officer Ramirez, one of the responding pair, a good kid I'd seen around the precinct, spotted me. His eyes widened. Then he saw Chief Reynolds stepping down from the stage, walking towards them. Ramirez's jaw practically unhinged. His partner, a woman I didn't recognize, looked like she'd walked into an alternate dimension. The moral violation was complete. Karen hadn't just made a nuisance call. She'd weaponized the very institution this event was designed to support, creating a spectacle of waste and disrespect. The air in my backyard, moments before filled with camaraderie, was now thick with a stunned, incredulous silence. Every officer present, every guest, was a witness. The evidence of her profound misjudgment was irrefutable, playing out in real time. And I, Mark Sterling, was going to ensure the recording of this particular crime scene was meticulously preserved. Chief Reynolds reached the 2 bewildered patrol officers. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously soft. "Officers, is there a problem?" Officer Ramirez, looking like he wished the earth would swallow him, stammered, Chief, sir, we had a call. A public disturbance?" Loud noise. Large, unruly gathering. Possible illegal activity. He practically winced as he recited the dispatch notes. The chief's gaze, cold and hard, flicked across the street to where Karen Pendleton stood, her smirk beginning to falter, a flicker of uncertainty dawning in her eyes as she witnessed the unexpected reunion. "Unruly gathering," Reynolds repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He gestured expansively at the assembly of his own officers, their families, the city council members now looking distinctly uncomfortable. "You mean this gathering? Of the entire North Precinct command staff? Half the detective bureau and a significant portion of our city's finest who are here, on their day off, to raise money for the families of their fallen brothers and sisters." The young officers looked like they wanted to melt into the asphalt. Ramirez visibly swallowed. Sir, the complainant was insistent. Mentioned violations of HOA bylaws, a history of problematic behavior by the homeowner. He glanced towards me, an apology in his eyes. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He was just doing his job, albeit a job instigated by a malicious fool. The chief's attention, a laser beam of controlled fury, swung back to Karen. Problematic behavior, he mused, loud enough for everyone, including Karen, to hear. Indeed, it seems the most problematic behavior today involves the deliberate misuse of emergency services, the filing of a false report, and the malicious disruption of a lawful, charitable assembly. Wouldn't you agree, Mrs. Pendleton? Karen, for the first time, looked genuinely scared. Her face, moments before alight with vindictive glee, had paled. The ruler, which she still clutched, seemed to tremble in her hand. She opened her mouth, then closed it, a fish gasping for air. The power dynamic had shifted with the brutal efficiency of a perfectly executed tactical maneuver. She was no longer the accuser. She was the accused, and the jury was composed of the very people she had sought to manipulate. The two patrol officers, now fully grasping the catastrophic nature of Karen's call, were backpedaling furiously. Sir, we were unaware of the nature of the event, Officer Ramirez said, his voice tight with mortification. We will, of course, be filing a full report on this misunderstanding. Oh, I'm sure you will, officer, Reynolds said, his tone leaving no doubt that misunderstanding was the politest possible term. And I expect a copy on my desk by end of shift, along with a detailed account of the complainant's statement. Verbatim, if you please. He then turned to the crowd. Folks, I apologize for this interruption. Please, enjoy the hospitality. We're here for a good cause, and we won't let a little civic overzealousness derail us. A smattering of applause, a release of tension. But the mood had irrevocably changed. The amusement was gone, replaced by a steely resentment directed squarely at the house across the street. As the chief returned to the stage, not to speak, but to quietly confer with his senior staff, I saw Alex, my tech-savvy neighbor from 3 doors down, give me a subtle thumbs up from beside the punch bowl. He was already on it. His phone had been out, discreetly recording, from the moment the sirens first sounded. He was an artist of digital documentation, a connoisseur of other people's poor decisions. My earlier, vague intention to simply weather Karen's storm had now solidified into a campaign. She hadn't just poked the bear, she'd attempted to call an airstrike on its charity picnic. The rules of engagement had changed. The fundraiser limped to its conclusion. The spirit somewhat dampened, but the resolve of the attendees hardened. Donations, ironically, spiked after Karen's stunt. It seemed public humiliation was a powerful fundraising tool. As the last of the guests departed, many of them pausing to offer words of support, and more interestingly, anecdotal evidence of their own past run-ins with Karen, I conferred with Alex. Got it all, he said, tapping his phone. Clear audio of her shrieking at Davies, the ruler incident, and then the full, unedited arrival of Officers Ramirez and What's-Her-Name. Plus, her gloating goose face when the sirens hit. Priceless. He was a kindred spirit, Alex, a digital guerrilla in the suburban wars, his conspiracy theories usually outlandish, but his technical skills undeniable. Send me everything, I told him. Raw files, no edits. He grinned. Operation OA Annihilation is a go? Something like that, I said, the ghost of a smile playing on my lips. Let's call it Project Pendleton's Comeuppance. Phase 1, Reconnaissance and Evidence Collation. Sarah joined us, handing me a bottle of water. The chief wants to talk to you before he leaves. He looks incandescent. That was an understatement. Chief Reynolds, when I found him near his car, was radiating a quiet, controlled fury that was far more intimidating than any outburst. "Mark," he began, his voice low, "what that woman did today was beyond the pale. It's not just the waste of resources, though God knows that's bad enough. It's the disrespect to Miller's memory, to every officer here." "I know, Frank," I said. "She picked the wrong fight, on the wrong day, with the wrong crowd." "Damn right she did." He paused. "The city attorney's office will be looking into the false report. That's a given. But the HOA, that's her little kingdom, isn't it?" "For now," I replied, my tone matching his. "These things have a way of adjusting." He nodded, understanding dawning. "If you need anything at all, statements, affidavits from my officers about the disruption, the prior harassment she's dished out to you, what they observed today." I appreciate that, Frank. I may take you up on it." He clapped my shoulder again, harder this time. "Give 'em hell, Mark." For Miller. As his car pulled away, the last of the blue and red reflections fading from the street, I felt a profound shift. The reluctance was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. This wasn't just about me anymore, or even about the fundraiser. This was about the abuse of power, however petty, and the corrosive effect of unchecked narcissism on a community. Karen Pendleton had, through her own spectacular arrogance, provided me with the motive, the means, and the opportunity. The tactical part of my brain, the part that had meticulously reconstructed crime scenes and built ironclad cases, was now fully engaged. My first step, even before cleaning up the last of the party debris, was to pull out the thick binder of HOA covenants, conditions, restrictions, the CCRs, the very scripture Karen purported to uphold. I'd read it before, of course, usually with a mixture of boredom and disbelief at its sheer pettifoggery. Now, I read it with a sniper's focus, looking for weaknesses, for ambiguities, for the clauses she herself had likely violated in her reign of terror. Alex, true to his word, had already emailed me a zip file. The video footage was damning. Karen, in glorious high definition, looking like a petty tyrant about to witness a public execution, her expression transforming into a mask of horrified disbelief as the officers recognized their chief. It was, as Alex had described, priceless. And it was just the beginning. I started a new file on my computer, labeling it simply Pendleton. Into it went Alex's videos, my own security footage, copies of her previous warning notes, and now a meticulously cross-referenced digital copy of the CCRs. The game was afoot. The days following the fundraiser were a blur of methodical preparation. My home office, usually a sanctuary for quiet reading and bill paying, transformed into a tactical operations center. The Pendleton file grew, not just with evidence related to the fundraiser debacle, but with a broader investigation into Karen's tenure as HOA president. Alex, my newly deputized sidekick, proved invaluable. He had a knack for digital archaeology, unearthing old HOA meeting minutes, archived neighborhood forum posts, and even disgruntled emails from former board members who had clashed with Karen and retreated. Bruised and defeated. "This woman's a one-man wrecking crew," Alex reported, scrolling through a particularly vitriolic exchange Karen had with a family who dared to install a basketball hoop. "She's got enemies, Mark, lots of them. They just needed a rallying point. I was becoming that rallying point. My legal ally in this burgeoning campaign was an old friend, David Chen, now a partner at a downtown law firm, a man whose courtroom demeanor was as sharp and unyielding as a shard of glass. I laid out the situation, the fundraiser incident being the inciting event, but also the pattern of harassment, the potential misuse of HOA authority. David listened, impassive at first, Then a slow smile spread across his face. "Mark, this isn't just malicious compliance. This is a potential class action for harassment and abuse of process, not to mention what the city might do to her for that 911 call." The HOA's insurance carrier would have a field day with her conduct. He agreed to draft a series of formal letters, meticulously citing HOA bylaws and relevant state statutes, to be sent to Karen and, crucially, to every other member of the HOA board, a largely supine body that had long since ceded all power to their president. The first letter detailed the events of the fundraiser, demanding a formal apology, a retraction of all prior baseless warnings, and an assurance that such harassment would cease. It also hinted, none too subtly, at potential legal ramifications for both Karen personally and the HOA as a whole, for fostering an environment of targeted harassment and for the liability incurred by her frivolous emergency call. The next phase involved leveraging Chief Reynolds' offer. I collected sworn affidavits from him, from Officers Ramirez and his partner, and from 3 other senior officers present at the fundraiser, all attesting to Karen's disruptive behavior, the baselessness of her complaints, and the waste of police resources. These were attached as exhibits to David's second, more forceful letter to the board. The response from Karen was predictable: a sputtering, indignant denial, a counter-accusation that I was the one harassing her, and a doubling down on her claims of bylaw violations. It was the flailing of a cornered animal. The other board members, however, were beginning to crack. One, a quiet accountant named Mrs. Henderson, called me privately. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, we had no idea it was this bad. Karen controls the information. We only ever hear her side." This was the break I needed. The silent majority was stirring, finding its voice, fueled by the sheer audacity of Karen's actions at the police fundraiser, an event many of them had heard about through the neighborhood grapevine, the story growing more legendary with each retelling. The narrative was shifting. Karen was no longer the diligent enforcer of rules. She was the neighborhood pariah, the woman who'd tried to shut down a charity event for fallen police officers. The beauty of it was that Karen, in her arrogance, had no idea of the storm gathering around her. She was still sending out violation notices for overgrown petunias and incorrectly shaded mailbox posts, oblivious to the fact that her own reign was about to be definitively and publicly pruned. The meticulous research, spearheaded by Alex's digital ferreting, and my own methodical cross-referencing of HOA financial statements, which, as a homeowner, I was entitled to review, began to bear more substantial rotten fruit. Karen Pendleton wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was, it appeared, a remarkably inept and potentially corrupt one. For years, the HOA's landscaping contract had been awarded, without competitive bidding, to Pendleton's Pristine Plantings, a company whose sole registered agent was one Gerald Pendleton, Karen's conspicuously underemployed brother-in-law. The fees were exorbitant, nearly 40% higher than comparable services in neighboring communities. Then there were the administrative expenses, a slush fund, it seemed, for Karen's personal stationery, her HOA president, embossed polo shirts, and suspiciously frequent consultations with a shadowy legal firm that seemed to specialize in threatening letters rather than actual litigation. Alex uncovered a series of email exchanges obtained through a disgruntled former board secretary who had kept meticulous personal records, where Karen explicitly directed the HOA treasurer to approve payments to Pendleton's Pristine Plantings, overriding concerns about cost and quality of service. "This is gold, Mark." Alex breathed, his eyes alight. "Nepotism, potential embezzlement, clear breach of fiduciary duty. She's not just a Karen. She's a mini Madoff with a penchant for pansies. This shifted the campaign from simple revenge against a neighborhood nuisance to a necessary cleansing of a corrupt institution. My motivations, already rooted in a deep sense of justice violated, now acquired an almost civic duty. We weren't just taking down a bully, we were reclaiming our community from someone who had exploited it for personal gain and petty power. David Chen, upon reviewing the new evidence, practically purred. "Mark, she's handed us the keys to the kingdom. Or rather, the keys to kick her out of it. We can petition for an emergency meeting, present a vote of no confidence, and demand an independent audit. The other board members, if they have an ounce of self-preservation, will fold." The strategy was refined. It wouldn't just be about the fundraiser incident, though that would be the dramatic opening act of our presentation. It would be a systematic dismantling of Karen's entire reign, piece by piece, bylaw by bylaw, supported by irrefutable evidence of her incompetence, her malice, and her corruption. We began to discreetly canvass the neighborhood, not just the disgruntled few, but everyone. We presented a sanitized, lawyer-approved summary of our findings, focusing on the financial mismanagement and the potential liability Karen was exposing the entire HOA to. The response was overwhelming. People who had suffered in silence for years, enduring Karen's petty dictates about fence heights and garbage can placement, were suddenly galvanized. The sheer effrontery of her calling the cops on a police fundraiser acted as a crystallizing agent for years of suppressed resentment. They signed the petition for an emergency meeting with an almost gleeful fervor. We needed 25% of homeowners to call such a meeting. We got nearly 70%. The tactical plan was now entering its execution phase. The board, faced with the petition and David Chen's increasingly ominous legal letters, had no choice but to schedule the emergency meeting. Karen, I learned through Mrs. Henderson, was apoplectic. She was reportedly trying to find a bylaw that would allow her to cancel the meeting or perhaps even excommunicate the signatories. But her power, once absolute in her own mind, was rapidly eroding. The ground beneath her meticulously manicured throne was crumbling. The stage was set for a public reckoning, a reckoning she had single-handedly and spectacularly brought upon herself. The night of the emergency HOA meeting, the community clubhouse, usually reserved for lackluster potlucks and sparsely attended board pronouncements, was packed. Every seat was taken, people lined the walls, a low murmur of anticipation filling the air. It felt less like an HOA meeting and more like a tribunal. Karen Pendleton sat at the head table, flanked by the other 4 board members, who looked distinctly uncomfortable, like hostages awaiting a very public negotiation. She attempted to project an air of serene control, but the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her microphone and the too bright, fixed smile betrayed her anxiety. She looked like a queen whose subjects had unexpectedly shown up with pitchforks and a working knowledge of parliamentary procedure. I sat in the front row, David Chen beside me, a thick binder of evidence on his lap. Alex was a few rows back, his laptop open, ready to project documents onto the pull-down screen if needed. This wasn't just tactical, it was theatrical, the culmination of weeks of meticulous planning. Karen opened the meeting with a rambling defense of her tenure, painting herself as a tireless servant of the community, a bulwark against chaos and declining property values. She even tried to frame the fundraiser incident as a misunderstanding, a result of her diligent concern for neighborhood safety. A few snorts of derision rippled through the audience. Then it was David Chen's turn. He didn't grandstand. He spoke calmly, with surgical precision, laying out the case against Karen, point by excruciating point. He began with the fundraiser. Exhibit A, he announced, and Alex projected the video of Karen, smug on her porch, as the police sirens wailed, then her face falling as Chief Reynolds himself emerged. A collective gasp, followed by angry muttering, swept the room. David then played the audio of her call to dispatch, her voice shrill and demanding, fabricating details of rowdy, possibly intoxicated individuals and blaring music. The contrast between her claims and the reality of a charity event attended by the city's police leadership was stark and damning. Next, he presented the affidavits from Chief Reynolds and the other officers. He detailed the city attorney's ongoing investigation into the false report. Karen's face was now ashen. He moved on to the financial irregularities. The no-bid contract for Pendleton's pristine plantings, complete with invoices and comparative quotes from other landscapers showing the gross overpayment. He showed the emails proving Karen's direct intervention to approve these payments. He highlighted the vague administrative expenses, questioning specific line items that reeked of personal use. With each revelation, the atmosphere in the room grew colder, more hostile towards Karen. Neighbors exchanged shocked, angry glances. Mrs. Henderson, the quiet accountant on the board, looked physically ill. When David Chen finished, there was a stunned silence, then a low, angry rumble from the audience. He then formally presented the motion. A vote of no confidence in President Karen Pendleton, her immediate removal from the board, and a mandate for a full, independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the past 5 years. Karen tried to speak, to object, her voice cracking. This is an outrage, a personal vendetta. These are lies, fabrications. But her bluster was gone, replaced by a desperate, unconvincing panic. One by one, residents stood up, not to debate, but to share their own stories of Karen's bullying, her arbitrary enforcement of rules, her vindictiveness. It was a dam bursting, years of suppressed frustration flooding the room. The vote was almost unanimous. Karen Pendleton was stripped of her presidency, removed from the board, her little fiefdom dismantled before her eyes. The motion for an independent audit also passed overwhelmingly. She sat there, utterly defeated, the meticulously constructed edifice of her power reduced to rubble. It was a public reckoning, delivered with the cold, hard precision she had so often, and so wrongly, wielded against others. The aftermath was quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet, but the settled, peaceful quiet that follows a long, overdue storm. Karen Pendleton, stripped of her title and her power, became almost invisible. Her perfectly manicured lawn remained, but the imperious figure that once lorded over it was seldom seen. The curtains of her house, which once twitched with judgmental energy, now remained drawn. The independent audit, as expected, uncovered a litany of mismanagement and self-dealing, enough for the HOA's insurance company to initiate its own investigation into potential fraud, and for the remaining board members, now led by a newly emboldened Mrs. Henderson, to consult with lawyers about recouping misused funds. Pendleton's pristine plantings lost its lucrative contract overnight, replaced by a local company that charged fair rates and actually did a decent job. The HOA bylaws underwent a significant review, with a new emphasis on transparency, accountability, and term limits for board positions. The reign of petty tyranny was over. My life returned to its previous rhythm, though with a subtle shift. There was a newfound warmth from neighbors, nods of acknowledgement, small gestures of gratitude. Leo, my son, declared me King of the Cul-de-sac, a title I politely declined. I was no king. I was simply a man who had been pushed too far, who had the training and the temperament to push back, systematically and decisively. The annual police benevolent fundraiser the following year was held in my backyard again. It was bigger, better attended, and noticeably Karen-free. Chief Reynolds, in his speech, made a pointed remark about true community spirit and the importance of neighbors looking out for each other, not just looking for trouble, which earned a knowing laugh from the crowd. Alex, now an unofficial consultant on all things tech for the newly reformed HOA, had set up a state-of-the-art sound system, ensuring the chief's words carried clearly, without any need for preemptive noise warnings. He also, with a wink, showed me a new feature on his drone. A Karen Dar that supposedly alerted him if any individual matching her description came within a 500-foot radius of my property line. I suspected he was joking. Mostly, Sarah and I sat on the deck, watching the festivities. The string lights glowed, the laughter of children mingled with the bluesy tunes from the sergeant's band, and the scent of barbecue hung heavy in the air. It was everything a community event should be: joyful, purposeful, and free from the shadow of arbitrary, malicious interference. Later that evening, after the last guest had departed, I stood by the fence separating my yard from what used to be Karen's observation post. The fence, once a symbol of boundaries contested, now just felt like a fence. A symbol of good neighbors, perhaps. I thought of Officer Miller, of the kids his sacrifice had left behind, and of the fund that would help secure their future. Justice, like revenge, is a dish best served cold, but sometimes it's also served with a side of community barbecue and the quiet satisfaction of a battle fought and won, not for personal glory, but for the simple right to live in peace, to support a worthy cause, and to host a goddamn party without someone calling the cops on the cops. The porch light above my door, a small beacon in the suburban night, felt like a return to control, a quiet assertion of order restored. And I knew, with a cold-blooded calm that was now deeply familiar, that if anyone ever crossed that particular line again, the Pendleton file, though archived, could always be reopened. Some lessons, it seems, need to be taught with surgical precision. The transition to the new HOA order was smoother than anyone anticipated, largely because the vacuum left by Karen's precipitous downfall was filled by a collective sigh of relief rather than a power struggle. Mrs. Henderson, surprisingly steely once freed from Karen's shadow, proved to be an adept and fair-minded leader. She, along with a newly elected board composed of reasonable human beings, began the painstaking process of untangling Karen's Gordian knot of arbitrary rules and mismanaged finances. The independent audit report was a thing of brutal beauty, a forensic accounting of years of petty graft and breathtaking incompetence. It detailed everything from the inflated landscaping contracts with Pendleton's pristine plantings to the misappropriation of funds for Karen's personal HOA branding, those infamous polo shirts and excessive stationery. Orders. The total sum wasn't life-altering for the HOA, but it was significant enough to cause outrage and provide ample grounds for legal action to recoup the losses. David Chen, on behalf of the HOA, sent a demand letter to Karen and her brother-in-law, outlining the findings and offering them a chance to make restitution to avoid further civil litigation. Last I heard, their lawyers were in discussion, which I took to mean they were trying to figure out how to pay back the money without admitting guilt too loudly. Karen herself became a ghost in the suburban machine. Her house remained, a monument to her former reign, but she was rarely seen. The aggressive perfection of her lawn seemed to mock her absence. Rumor had it she was spending more time at her sister's place in another state. Whether it was shame, fear of legal repercussions, or simply the inability to face a community that had so thoroughly rejected her, I didn't know, nor did I particularly care. My role in her downfall, while widely known, wasn't something I advertised. The quiet respect of my neighbors was enough. The tactical precision I'd employed was, for me, simply a logical extension of a lifetime spent bringing order to chaos. Karen had been a localized source of chaos, and I had, with a certain grim satisfaction, restored order. Alex, my tech-savvy sidekick, became a minor celebrity in the neighborhood, his drone footage and digital sleuthing skills now legendary. He was appointed, by popular acclaim, as the chair of the new HOA Technology and Transparency Committee, a role he embraced with his usual eccentric zeal. He even proposed a new bylaw requiring all HOA board meetings to be live-streamed, a suggestion that was met with surprisingly little resistance. The supporting cast of characters in this suburban drama found their own forms of closure. Chief Reynolds occasionally ribbed me about being a one-man internal affairs unit for HOAs. Officer Ramirez, whenever he saw me, would shake his head and grin. The memory of that disastrous call, now a shared anecdote rather than a source of mortification. Even the silent majority of neighbors, once cowed by Karen, found a new sense of empowerment, attending meetings, voicing opinions, actively participating in the governance of their own community. The locked gate, in a metaphorical sense, had been psychological closure for Karen, her world shrinking as her power evaporated. For the rest of us, it was the opening of a gate, a return to a more open, less fear-driven existence. The blood, in this war, had been purely metaphorical, spilled in boardrooms and legal filings, not on battlefields. But the cost to Karen's reputation and her carefully constructed world was, I suspect, devastating. My family, Sarah and Leo, were my emotional anchors throughout. Sarah's quiet support and Leo's irreverent humor had kept the righteous fury from consuming the cold, calculated vengeance. It was for them, as much as for Miller's memory or the integrity of the police fundraiser, that I had engaged in this fight. A man's home is his castle, but it's also part of a community, and that community deserved better than Karen Pendleton. The legal revenge thriller had played out. The tactical justice fantasy had been realized. The suburban horror had, indeed, turned into a war zone, albeit one fought with bylaws and bank statements rather than bullets. And this first-person retaliation opera had reached its final, satisfying crescendo. The final act, in the Pendleton saga, played out not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, but in the quiet, mundane process of legal attrition. Faced with the irrefutable evidence from the forensic audit and the looming threat of a protracted and embarrassing civil suit, Karen and her brother-in-law chose to settle. They agreed to repay a significant portion of the mismanaged funds to the HOA, a sum that, while not covering every last cent of her profligacy, was substantial enough to be considered a victory. It was a quiet capitulation, a far cry from her previously belligerent assertions of innocence, but no less definitive. The funds were earmarked for community improvement projects, a fitting, almost poetic end to money that had been siphoned off for personal aggrandizement. The first project, unanimously approved by the new board, was the installation of a small, tastefully designed memorial plaque near the clubhouse entrance, dedicated to fallen local law enforcement officers, with a specific mention of Officer Miller. It was a subtle but clear statement, a permanent reminder of the values Karen had so spectacularly failed to respect. The news of the settlement spread through the neighborhood, not with triumphant gloating, but with a sense of weary satisfaction. Justice, in its slow, grinding way, had been served. For me, the true closure came a few months later. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and I was raking leaves in my front yard. A moving truck pulled up to Karen Pendleton's house. I paused, leaning on my rake. Karen emerged, smaller and grayer than I remembered, her face etched with a bitterness that seemed to have settled permanently. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge any of the neighbors who discreetly watched from their windows. She supervised the movers with a kind of defeated apathy, a stark contrast to the aggressive micromanagement she had once displayed. The "for sale" sign went up an hour later. The house sold quickly. The new owners were a young couple with 2 small children, seemingly oblivious to the property's recent notoriety, drawn by good schools and a suddenly welcoming community. They painted the front door a cheerful, non-HOA-approved shade of blue, and no one said a word. The balance had been restored. The intense personal investment I'd made, the cold-blooded calm masking the explosive emotional undercurrents of righteous fury, had paid off. The legally lethal strategy, executed with dramatic and surgical precision, had achieved its objective. The deadpan sarcasm I'd often felt, and sometimes allowed to creep into my inner monologue, now gave way to a quiet sense of peace. The porch light still shone, a symbol not just of my control over my own domain, but of a community that had reclaimed itself. The fence remained, no longer a line of defiance, but a simple marker of where one friendly yard ended and another began. The moral cost of action, in this case, had been negligible for me, but catastrophic for the antagonist. And that, I reflected, was the very definition of poetic justice. You won't believe what happened next is usually how these stories begin. But in this instance, the most unbelievable part was how thoroughly and how justly a petty tyrant was undone by her own hubris, and by the collective will of a community that simply decided enough was enough, especially when enough involved calling the cops on their own fundraiser.